Welcome back, everyone. Today we're doing a deep dive into something pretty complex, President Trump's new tariffs.
Yeah, these tariffs on imports from Canada,
Hmm.
Mexico, and China, they're causing a lot of debate and concern about, a possible global trade war.
Definitely a lot to unpack there. We've got a ton of sources to help us figure this out. News articles from the New York Times, MSNBC, and even some international perspectives from the South China Morning Post Global News, and of course some in-depth economic analysis.
Yeah, by looking at all these different sources, we can get a clearer picture of what's going on and what it all means.
Okay, so let's start with the breaking news. Trump just announced these tariffs, 25% on almost all goods from Canada and Mexico and 10% on Chinese goods.
And they're effective immediately.
Yeah.
The White House says these tariffs are a national emergency measure to address illegal immigration and fentanyl trafficking and to protect American jobs and manufacturing.
One thing that really jumped out at me was in that South China Morning Post article. They pointed out that the tariffs on Chinese goods are actually lower than those on Canadian and Mexican goods. That's kind of strange, isn't it?
It is a bit, and it might mean there's more to this than just economics. China's a much bigger economic power than either Canada or Mexico. So Trump might be trying to walk a fine line. He wants to look strong globally, but he also doesn't want a full-blown trade war with China.
So there's some serious strategic maneuvering happening behind the scenes. I get it. What about Canada and Mexico? How are they reacting?
Well, Global News is reporting that Canada has already announced retaliatory tariffs on $155 billion worth of American goods. They're calling for international support and encouraging Canadians to buy Canadian products. Prime Minister Trudeau even gave a speech to the nation, urging people to support local businesses.
Wow, that's a pretty strong response. What about Mexico?
Mexico is rejecting Trump's accusations of being involved with criminal organizations and emphasizing cooperation. They're calling for dialogue, but also suggesting they might take countermeasures.
So they're trying to stand up for themselves while still maintaining a good relationship with the U.S.
Exactly. It's a tough spot. They're facing economic pressure from the tariffs, but they also depend heavily on the U.S. for trade.
And what about the European Union? I remember something about future tariffs on them, too.
You're right. Trump has hinted at tariffs on the EU, saying they haven't been fair to the U.S. in trade deals. This raises the stakes even more, and it seems like this is just the beginning of a much bigger economic conflict.
So we've got a lot of international reactions and potential retaliation going on. Let's try to understand what this all means economically. You said earlier that these tariffs could affect our everyday lives. So how exactly do tariffs work, and how could they impact prices and what we buy?
Well, tariffs are basically taxes on imported goods. So when a tariff is imposed, the cost of those goods goes up. And usually importers pass that increased cost to us as consumers through higher prices.
So, like, if I usually buy something that's imported from Mexico, now it could become a lot more expensive because of these tariffs.
That's right. And those price increases can have a ripple effect throughout the whole economy.
Hmm. Okay, I want to understand these ripple effects. What are some of the maybe unintended consequences of these tariffs? The MSNBC article talked about washing machines, for example.
Yeah, the washing machine example shows how tariffs can have unexpected consequences. Back in his first term, Trump put tariffs on imported washing machines. This was supposed to protect American jobs in that industry. But what happened was prices went up for consumers, even for washing machines made in the U.S.
Oh, so even if something isn't directly affected by the tariffs, the price could still go up.
Exactly. Domestic manufacturers see a chance to raise their prices when foreign competition gets more expensive. So we end up paying more no matter where the product comes from.
That's a really good point. Shows just how complicated these economic systems are. It's not just simple cause and effect.
All right. And it makes you wonder if these tariffs will actually do what they're supposed to. Will they really protect American jobs and boost manufacturing, or will they just end up hurting consumers and causing all sorts of problems?
And how are businesses reacting to all this? The CNBC article had some interesting examples of both big and small companies dealing with these new tariffs.
One thing that big companies are doing is something called front-loading imports. They're basically rushing to import as much as they can before the tariffs hit. Imagine stocking up on your favorite snacks before the price goes up. Big companies like Walmart and Columbia Sportswear mentioned in that CNBC article are doing this to try and soften the impact.
Makes sense, but like we said, not every business has the money to do that.
Exactly. For smaller companies, front-loading just isn't possible. They might not have the storage space or the cash flow for that.
So they're stuck trying to figure out how to deal with these higher costs?
Think of it this way. A global supply chain is like a complex puzzle. Each piece is at a different stage of production. The CNBC article talked about how these tariffs are messing up these carefully built puzzles, Companies like Deer Stags that rely on imported materials are facing delays and shortages because the pieces aren't fitting together anymore.
It feels like we're just seeing the beginning of this.
You're right. The CNBC article suggested these disruptions could lead to a whole cascade of problems. Think about all the industries that depend on things like imported steel or aluminum. If those materials become more expensive or harder to get, it could affect everything from construction to manufacturing.
So what does this mean for us as consumers? Could we actually see shortages or price increases on lots of different products?
It's definitely possible. As those supply chains get tighter, it could cause delays in getting products to stores. And those delays, plus the increased cost of imported materials, will probably mean higher prices for us.
So it's not just washing machines and shoes we have to worry about. This could have a big impact on a lot of different industries and products.
Right? You might see your favorite coffee getting more expensive, or that new car you were thinking about suddenly being way out of your budget.
Okay, I'm starting to understand how complicated all this is economically. But I'm curious about the bigger picture. Is Trump really trying to change global trade, or are these tariffs just a tactic in negotiations? The MSNBC article mentioned both possibilities.
It's probably a bit of both. Trump has said he wants to renegotiate trade deals and bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. He sees these tariffs as a way to force other countries to give him what he wants.
So it's like a high-stakes poker game. Everyone's trying to bluff each other into backing down. But what if no one does?
That's the scary part. If these countries refuse to budge and respond with their own tariffs, it could turn into a full-blown trade war.
And what would a trade war look like for regular people? What would that actually mean for us?
Imagine going to the grocery store and seeing empty shelves where your favorite imported foods used to be.
Mm.
Or trying to buy a new PV only to find that the price is double because of tariffs on parts from other countries.
That doesn't sound good at all.
It's not. Trade wars hurt everyone involved. They lead to higher prices, less choice, and instability in the economy.
The Global News article mentioned that Trump's executive order actually lets him raise tariffs even more if Canada retaliates. Isn't that just asking for trouble?
It does raise concerns about things getting even worse. It suggests that Trump is willing to keep pushing this strategy even if it leads to a trade war.
So we've got potential economic chaos, rising prices, and the threat of a trade war. What's the bottom line here? Are there any good things that could come from these tariffs, or is it all bad news?
Well, it's important to remember that there are different opinions on this. Some people say that in the long run, these tariffs could actually help American manufacturing and create jobs.
So there's a chance this could actually benefit the U.S. economy in the end.
It's possible, but it's a gamble. The risks are huge, and nobody really knows what will happen.
Sounds like we're in for a bumpy ride. I'm really interested to hear more about the political side of this and what the possible outcomes might be. So we were just talking about that front-loading imports thing. Can you explain a little more about what that actually means?
Sure. So front-loading imports basically means that companies are like racing to bring in as much product as they can before the tariffs kick in. You know, like when you stock up on your favorite stuff before the price goes up. Companies like Walmart and Columbia Sportswear, they were mentioned in that CNBC article, they're doing this to try and avoid the worst of it.
Okay, that makes sense. But like we were saying, not every business can pull that off.
Exactly. Smaller companies like Deer Stags, they don't have that option. They probably don't have the space to store all that extra inventory or the money to pay for it up front.
So they're kind of stuck just trying to figure out how to absorb these extra costs.
Yeah. It's tough. Think about it this way. A global supply chain, it's like this super complicated puzzle, right? Each piece is like a different stage in making a product. The CNBC article talked about how these tariffs are messing up those puzzles that companies have so carefully put together. Companies like Deer Stags, they rely on materials from other countries, and now they're dealing with delays and shortages because those pieces aren't fitting together so smoothly anymore.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It feels like this is just the beginning of the problems.
You're right. The CNBC article actually suggested that these disruptions could cause a whole bunch of other problems. Think about all those industries that rely on imported steel or aluminum, for example. If those materials suddenly get more expensive or harder to get, well, that could affect everything from building houses to making cars.
So what does this mean for us regular shoppers? Could we end up seeing things missing from the shelves or price increases on a bunch of different stuff?
It's definitely a possibility. You know, as those supply chains get more and more strained, it could take longer to get products to the stores. And those delays, along with the higher cost of imported materials, well, they'll probably lead to higher prices for consumers in the end.
So it's not just about washing machines and shoes anymore. It seems like this could affect a whole range of different products and industries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You might even see your favorite coffee going up in price, or maybe that new car you were thinking about buying is suddenly out of your budget.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I'm starting to get how complicated this whole thing is from an economic perspective. But I'm also curious about the bigger picture here. Is Trump actually trying to change how global trade works? Or is he just using these tariffs as a way to get what he wants in negotiations? That MSNBC article seemed to suggest both were possible.
It's probably a little bit of both. Trump has always said he wants to redo those trade deals and bring manufacturing back to America. And he seems to see these tariffs as a way to pressure those other countries into giving him what he wants.
So it's like a high stakes game of poker then. Everyone's bluffing and hoping the other guy folds first. But what happens if nobody backs down?
That's the thing. That's the risk. If these countries dig in and refuse to budge, and they hit back with their own tariffs, well, it could easily turn into a full-blown trade war.
And what would that actually look like for everyday people? I mean, what would a trade war really mean for us?
Just imagine going to the grocery store and seeing a bunch of empty shelves where all your favorite imported foods used to be. Or imagine trying to buy a new TV and the price is like doubled because of tariffs on all the parts that come from other countries.
That sounds pretty bad.
It is.
There.
Trade wars are bad for everyone. They cause prices to go up, they limit our choices, and they destabilize the whole economy.
And that Global News article mentioned something pretty worrying. They said that Trump's executive order allows him to increase those tariffs even more if Canada retaliates. Isn't that just going to make things worse?
Yeah, it definitely raises concerns about things escalating. It makes it seem like Trump's willing to just keep pushing this strategy, even if it ends up causing a trade war.
So we've got the possibility of economic chaos, prices going up, and this looming threat of a trade war. Is there any good news here? Are there any potential benefits to these tariffs at all, or is it all just doom and gloom?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are different perspectives on this.
Mm-hmm.
Some people argue that in the long run, these tariffs could actually lead to a revival of American manufacturing and create more jobs here at home.
So it is possible that this could actually end up being good for the U.S. economy.
It is a possibility, but it's a big risk. The potential downsides are pretty serious, and nobody can say for sure what's going to happen.
It definitely feels like we're in for a wild ride. I'm really curious to dig deeper into the political side of all this and what the potential outcomes could be. So we've been talking about the economics and all the potential consequences of these new tariffs. Now I want to get into the politics. What's the strategy behind all of this?
Well, it's interesting how much economics and politics are tied together. Some analysts think Trump's using these tariffs as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations.
So it's a power move. He's trying to show everyone who's boss on the world stage.
It's definitely part of it. The MSNBC article talked about how Trump always talks about trade in terms of winning and losing. He wants to be seen as a tough leader who puts America first.
But doesn't that come at a cost? We talked about all the potential harm to the economy, not just for other countries, but for American businesses and consumers too.
Right. And that brings up a really important question. Is this strategy going to work? Will it actually achieve what he wants, or will it backfire and cause even more problems?
The MSNBC article mentioned a Quinnipiac poll that showed a lot of American voters are actually worried about the economic damage these tariffs could cause.
That's a good point. It shows that even here in the U.S., people have different opinions about whether this is the right approach.
So what does all this mean for the average person? How could these tariffs actually affect our lives?
Think about the things you buy every day. A lot of them are part of these global supply chains, which means they involve materials or parts from different countries. These tariffs could disrupt those supply chains, and that could mean higher prices, shortages, or even some products becoming unavailable.
So like the next time I go to the store, my favorite imported cheese could be way more expensive. Or maybe some fruits and vegetables will be out of season because they're harder to import.
Exactly. And it goes way beyond groceries.
Yeah.
Think about electronics, clothes, cars. Pretty much everything is affected by global trade in some way.
It's starting to feel like these tariffs could have an impact on pretty much everything we do. So what should we be looking out for in the coming weeks and months? What are the signs that things are getting better or worse?
We'll keep an eye on how Canada, Mexico, and China respond to these tariffs. Are they willing to negotiate, or are they going to make things worse with their own retaliatory measures?
And what about here in the U.S.? Are businesses and consumers starting to feel the effects?
Watch for news about companies raising prices, laying off workers, or having trouble getting the materials they need. Pay attention to how confident people are about the economy and whether they're spending less because of it.
It feels like we're at a turning point. The decisions made in the next few weeks and months could have a lasting impact on the global economy and on all of our lives. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
Here's something to think about. These tariffs could actually change the way we buy and make things. They might speed up the trend of regionalization, where countries rely more on local or regional supply chains instead of global ones.
That's an interesting thought. Makes you wonder what the world will be like in 5 or 10 years if this keeps going. Will we see a shift away from globalization and towards a more fragmented economic landscape?
It's definitely something to consider. These tariffs are a reminder that the global economy is always changing, and the choices we make today will shape what the world looks like tomorrow.
It's been a really fascinating deep dive. Thanks for walking us through such a complex and important topic. It's clear that these tariffs have huge implications, and we'll definitely be keeping a close eye on how this all unfolds. And to our listeners, stay informed, stay engaged, and think about how these changes on the global stage might affect your own lives. Thanks for joining us.